Pete Winn, hello and welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm good, mate. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I have a few things that I want to talk with you about. First of all, shout out to the guys that did the Cheat Code conference at the end of last year. And I had the pleasure of being on a panel with you. And we just touched on some stuff that was so fascinating and not something that's necessarily totally obvious that you're working on. And we'll dive into that. So if you could help, Pete, if someone's listening that's not heard of you before, to tee you up, I once heard you describe yourself as an anarchist in a polo shirt. But as we discussed at the end of last week, that's now transferred to a Hawaiian shirt and no shoes. But no, just a bit of an intro as to who you are and what you're working on. And then we'll dive into what we touched on the panel, which I'll frame a little later.
Yeah, no worries. So I almost put a non-Hawaiian shirt on.
I would have been so upset.
Like that's not okay. So I thought I'll keep with this. Yeah, so my name's Pete Winn. I guess currently I founded a company called Other Stuff in Australia, so based out of West Australia with my business partner, Andy David. So we focus on a few different things. Broadly, we have like an idea of the future, which we define around this thesis of up, up, down, which is you want to build productivity up, capital up, risk down. And we can always go into that later if need be. But weirdly, that maps quite nicely to a few technologies that are interesting at the moment. Like productivity up is AI, capital up is Bitcoin, and risk down is AI, Bitcoin, and Nostr is kind of our view. So that was awesome. Kind of the genesis of that company. Now, about 3 or 4 months ago, we started talking quite a lot with Stackwork, who are a US-based company that do a lot of business process automation traditionally. And I think in the last couple of years, they got really into the idea of business process automation married with AIs. And so we've been partnering a lot with those guys at the moment, just exploring different opportunities for how you can marry AI and Bitcoin, and particularly like a global workforce of people that can complete jobs for you. So Stackwork have a set of products. Like one of the core ones is their business process outsourcing tools, which effectively allow you to complete any process inside your business, either via traditional computing tools, so like automations that you can do on the computer, or via an AI language model. So you can build agent frameworks and workflows that can do complex tasks for you, or you can pay a human to do it for you with Bitcoin. So you have like the best of all worlds here. And then the approach that we're looking at there is like, how can you build almost like an AI native business where everything is AI at first, and then we go out to the human when we need to. So humans at the edge. So that's been very interesting work. Another component that I've been doing a big deep dive in with those guys is around their bounties platform. So as a company, being a technology company, we don't have developers on staff. So instead, we have like 100 different, 400 people around the world that we can issue bounties to. So we do open source development. We issue a bounty for a particular task that's paid in Bitcoin. And then we get that work done by the crowd. Now, the process of issuing out all that work and then getting all that work back is done by me as the product manager. That can be quite a logistically challenging task. So the role specifically that I'm looking at is this methodology called Hive, which is how do you take an AI native methodology for developing new products using AI. And so again, it's like minimal teams, fast moving, high momentum product development. So
awesome, Pete. Fucking awesome. Get into it. And good luck with all of those things you're working on, because it sounds very exciting. I think what's quite a fun place to start is, and putting this all to pieces in a way, you responded to some, I can't remember if this is on Twitter or now actually more recently on Nostr, but to give a kind of use case scenario, I was looking at Bitcoin and thinking about how it's going to change the world around us, and how do I potentially get myself some equity positions in good cash flowing businesses that I can then stack sats with. And we were talking about sat stacking machines. And then it's this idea of, okay, well, on the local high street, you've got the florist, you've got the butcher, you've got the barber, you've got the cafe. Are these people doing it because they love it or because they're just making money? And equally then when you get like a particularly good florist, it's like, okay, well, how do they then expand? And the specific example I'll give is this pizza restaurant I loved in Melbourne. It's like this guy, Michael, he was such a great guy, front of house, buzzing business. And I think he got investment from his owner to then start his own thing. But you can't recreate that front of house experience in a second location without in some way watering down the experience, because that same person can't be somewhere else. And I was thinking, okay, but maybe if a super specialist restaurateur, for example, is able to use Bitcoin on the back end, they can just sell a shitload of pizza and buy Bitcoin and then get great capital growth potential with that. And we had some back and forth. And this is where I think some of your actual work really came through. It's like, oh my gosh, you're already doing this essentially. But you're like, well, Jake, that might work, but you got to bring in AI. And maybe that's where we can pick up the thread of the conversation from. So why is it the case, in your view then, Pete, that, on the high street, why wouldn't you go super specialist? You'd make the best pizza ever and just have one location doing it and use it to buy Bitcoin. And then how does AI come into that to actually make it like potentially a good investment?
All right. So maybe this might involve me not answering your question for a moment.
And that's okay, because it's very broad, but I feel like it's, take it anywhere. I don't mind. Yeah.
So I think, if I remember the conversation, I think it was on Nostr, because people talk on Nostr and they just broadcast on Twitter. But
true.
I think I'd say it was about edge was the idea.
Yes.
It was. I think like this happens to a lot of Bitcoiners after an amount of time where you start to go, oh well, I need to find more ways to accumulate Bitcoin. It can't just be like me earning a salary, or it can't be like, I want to own something. I want to own this like cash flowing business. I want that business to then buy Bitcoin on its behalf. And I want to do like a sailor playbook, or like what I've heard like Preston talking about on the Investors Podcast. That sounds like something I'm interested in. And we all look for it. And there is this idea. I've had the same conversations with my business partner when we were starting other stuff. And this has been an ongoing discussion for almost 3 years now, where we would be looking at, okay, well, what's the next big investment, right? It was Bitcoin. Is it still just buy Bitcoin and shut up? Is it buy Bitcoin? Is it buy Bitcoin and then buy a business? Is it buy a business that buys Bitcoin? Is it something else? And what we were always trying to figure out is we felt it was buy cash flowing businesses, to leverage money into cash flowing businesses, then use the cash flow to purchase Bitcoin, and you're probably going to outperform any other business. So maybe that would be almost like a hedge fund type of model. You say, okay, well, I'll set up like a private equity fund, and I'll go and raise money, and I'll buy businesses, and I'll just do a Bitcoin back end. But when you think about trying to sell that to somebody else that's not yourself, you start to think like, oh, I don't know if this works, right? Because I'm fairly convinced this works. I don't know if I'd spend other people's money on something like this, because it feels like I'm betting on the Bitcoin price going up. Now, I've got a lot of faith that the Bitcoin price goes up. I don't know if I'd want to go out and push that narrative that like, here's a great idea if the Bitcoin price goes up. So then my view came more like, well, would I do this myself? And it's like, yeah, I mean, I would. So I have left various jobs and looked at opportunities to do this in different businesses. The bit that always gave me pause about the specific business I would buy is like, well, what's my edge inside this business? So this is where we come back to the edge to say, well, why me? Why am I the right person to take this business on? Am I buying this off of somebody that has a great business, and that person, so let's say in a restaurant, is it a great restaurant because of the person that's running the restaurant? In which case that is going to be hard to replicate somewhere else. Or is this business a great business because it's a retail business and it's, it sells the best ovens in WA? And I think you make a lot of money selling ovens in WA, it turns out. But if I buy it, like, do we lose all the network effect and the brand that's wrapped up in this particular person that's been selling these things? So it's like, okay, well then you start to think, well, maybe I can keep the operators in. We can do some sort of like leverage buyout over a period of time, and then I use that to get the Bitcoin and say, but then for that operator to sell you the business, now what's in it for them? Like, why are they selling that business? Well, maybe it's somebody that's towards the end of their career and they're just looking to move it on. Okay, well, that could be an option, but now it's going to be harder for me to replicate whatever the secret sauce was in that business. And the more I looked at it, the more I thought, well, if I was going to go through this process, what I need is some sort of an edge. And then this is where we arrived at the kind of the other stuff, up, up, down framework, was just like, look, okay, the thing is, this all is downstream of productivity up. Right now, I could take almost any small business in Australia, or I mean, let's say globally, I think there's something like 300 million small businesses that operate around the world.
Wow.
I think it's 60 to 80% of them are one-man bands.
Really?
And it's not obvious that like a single person is the correct size of any of those businesses. But if you start, you talk to a few people that are running businesses and trying to scale them up, certainly in that like 1 to 10 sort of bracket, one of the things that you realize is that that next marginal employee, specifically in Australia, is incredibly expensive. You could be like a one-man band and you could earn $500,000 and you're having a great life. And then you hire a second person, and that second person is going to cost you about 200,000 Aussie dollars once you wrap in like all of the payroll, like all the costs associated with them, all the ongoing insurance, super contributions, like there's potentially training, there's like what happens when they go. Like there's a lot of invested cost in that, and it makes it very difficult to scale those businesses. We thought, well, there's probably a great opportunity here to look at just how do you add productivity into these businesses in a way that doesn't require more human capital to be injected into the business, because this is such a big step change. If I can only increase the growth rate of my business by adding in humans, and each human is a kind of like, let's call it a $100,000 to $200,000 investment, then I can't make bets for less than 100 to 200,000. And to actually make that bet pay off, I need to be fairly confident that I'm going to get a return in the, let's just call it 2 to 500,000 sort of bracket. And so it felt like there was just an opportunity to release a lot of capital there by just having an edge that focused on productivity. So last year, I got really into sort of AI. Prior to that, I was working at Fedi as the head of product over there and doing a lot of work around like Fedi mints, communities. And one area we were looking at was around how people would earn. And we'd sort of played around with some ideas around, okay, well, AI has become a big thing in this time period. So early 2023. What would that mean in the context of Fedi mints or communities or like people like in the global south that might be looking to earn money? Like how might it change the way they earn and what they do? And then how would we respond to that? And one of the things that I realized was like, this it's going to make it very easy for a lot of people to learn new skills. It's going to make like the individual is going to become way more productive if they start using some of these tools. These tools can be programmed not just as sort of apps and this kind of call and response method that we're used to in like ChatGPT. I can write sort of agent systems for these things. I could write workflows for these things. I could make complex processes. Like, so I have a background in sort of business process engineering as well. And it's like, I could just design the whole process to run just with the AI. And then, maybe I could use a human, but I could use the human sparingly. So I could probably get a lot of productivity improvements out of this. And then, we took that as the kind of goal to go into other stuff. Is like, okay, well, that would probably be the edge, would be you start with productivity. So the goal here would be the edge would be, all right, well, how could I take a business that has sort of 10 people in it, instead of doing like a lean Six Sigma style, like process re-engineering and then squeezing out 50% return of that? Because you can always get good returns with that sort of thing. Standardizing processes is like hugely impactful. But instead of doing that in the standard world, why don't we just make an assumption that AI is actually here to stay, that there are huge productivity gains available for companies that actually go along this path and actually rearrange their process to be AI native first. And let's start doing that. And then that gives you an edge to go out and acquire businesses and say, okay, well, what if I could grab your business and I could drop your cost base by 50%. If I drop your cost base by 50%, your enterprise value goes up like hundreds and hundreds of percent overnight. So if we can take these businesses and transform them, then we've got an edge to really drive that productivity, which then leads to, okay, well, if you do that, you capture a lot of value very quickly. Now, the interesting thing is you're going to want to keep that value and put it somewhere. So Bitcoin is interesting to all Bitcoiners. Maybe a more nuanced view of this is that if you enter a market and you can drop the cost of production of a good by 50%, and you don't have a technical moat or a regulatory moat around that business, what's very likely to happen is that you will decrease the revenue of your own business, in the sense that you'll go in, we'll drop the costs, people will see what's happening, they'll then begin to copy, they then to compete, and over time what we're going to see is like the pricing power of this particular industry is going to start to get eroded away, which means that we might be, if we took an example, so it's a business that's turning over $10 million a year, it's got a $9 million a year cost base. We take the business from a $9 million cost base to a $5 million cost base over the course of a year. And so say year two, all of a sudden now we've got our $10 million of revenue, and we assume no revenue growth here. All of a sudden now you're making $5 million a year instead of $1 million a year. So huge improvement, huge uplift in the enterprise value there. But then we could project maybe 5 years down the line, and you might look at this and say, okay, well, what's happened here is we had a business that was $10 million, like notional revenue a year. We dropped the cost base to $5 million a year. And then over let's say, 3 to 5 year period, we've just compressed that back down now. So now it's a business that's got $6 million a year of revenue and a cost base of $5 million a year. And so with all the competition, we're going to eat away that margin. So I think what is available right now, if I go back to this framing of like, well, what is like the trade that's going to be really impactful in the AI space? Why do I think you need like AI as the edge? It's that I think that there's going to be a short period of time where we take multiple different businesses and different sort of industries around the world, and we're going to see massive competition and cost compression in these businesses because of AI. And I think what will happen there is that, yes, everything's going to be much cheaper in 5 years, but there's going to be this effectively like a 5-year arbitrage trade where you could make huge outsized returns from regular, good cash flow businesses. Now, I'm not thinking right now so much about like restaurants and physical environment, but if we think about software engineering businesses, contract engineering type stuff, like you can imagine that that's going to be heavily impacted by AI, but they still have cash flow and locked in clients and consumers right now. So we could see a huge reduction in the cost base, capture a lot of value for a few years, pricing power comes down. Okay, now we're back to like a 10% revenue business, but at a lower scale. But in the meantime, you might be capturing, like 20 years of profit very quickly. So the question becomes, well, how do you retain that profit? Well, one of the first things you might want to do is buy Bitcoin, because then you retain the profit now. And then let's say instead of earning it over 20 years, you earn it all in 3 years, right? We'll put it into Bitcoin. It'll still be here in 20 years. It's a minimum, right? We're gonna retain that purchasing power of that time, potentially grow it. The next thing that always occurred to me was, okay, well, there's a second order consequence to this level of automation. If I truly believe that we've got this sort of, let's call it 3 to 8 year period of time where we're going to see like a huge productivity spike across multiple different industries that we think is going to go on, it's going to lead to a lot more work getting done a lot cheaper by less people. The flow-on effect of that is that a lot of people will lose their jobs, unfortunately. And if that happens, like that won't be something that happens in isolation with no follow-up. Like, I let's say I was a politician, God help me, I would do something about that. I'd say, oh, this is unbearable. This can't happen. What's the government going to do? Been around Bitcoin for a few years. You start to realize the government's response is generally to print more money. So it's quite likely that despite the fact that AI is a hugely deflationary technology, the sort of government response you might expect to something like that, and a lot of people losing their jobs, would be more aligned to like a UBI. It could be more government work. It could be more public sector work. it's very likely that the answer would be that they're going to start inflating like your local money supply to cope with the fact that a lot of people are losing their jobs. So again, in that sort of world, I would want to own something with a natural inflation hedge. So moving from like my productivity into Bitcoin. So if we go up, 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 down, right? The model here is up is productivity. So like I use AI to improve my productivity and unleash more productivity per person inside my business. The next up is going to be like, all right, I need to retain this capital. So what do I do with that capital? Well, I move it into Bitcoin because now it's going to stay there. So the money I earn now will still be relevant in 10 years. It'll still be relevant in 20 years. If anything, it's going to be a much bigger figure at those times. And then I've got to worry about down, which is I want to bring my risk down. So I think in going through this journey, what we're going to see is that I can make money from a productivity point of view. I can keep money from a Bitcoin point of view, but I need to worry about how do I retain that against potentially inflation or seizure or something like that in the future if it's seen to be like an issue with government. I would say, right, okay, well, again, Bitcoin becomes the place that you want to put that money. So that would be that was the thinking behind a lot of this was like,
amazing.
All right, what's the trade that you would want if you could do anything?
Yeah. And what I love when I hear a story like that is the different scenarios that you were in through your career that you kind of piece together all these bits. You're like, oh, I think this is actually the way to go. And I always love hearing those stories. Like, how did you get to that point? And so I'm intrigued, Pete. It's obviously a public conversation, so there's no need to reveal anything that you don't want to about the internal workings of your business. But so from an investment perspective, I completely follow you that AI is a massive productivity gain, and therefore the balance sheet of a business could be radically improved in terms of profit margin. So, okay, so how do you actually do that? And specifically from a kind of equity valuation perspective, do you raise a fund, or is other stuff just a private business that you put your own money into, and you're going to go and look for a certain type of company and you're going to buy it onto the balance sheet of other stuff? And then like if the valuation of that business rapidly improves because you increase the profit margin in 2 years of integrating AI, are you going to then sell that business to someone else and capture the equity improvement from those two, entry points and then potential exit? But then who are you exiting to? You're dropping your bags at someone else's door. Is that how would that work? And is it actually just a play of like, okay, over this 3-year period, we're just going to pocket a ton of extra cash and we're going to sit in Bitcoin, and then you just own the business, but at a lower valuation after the incorporation of the profit margin improvement. And then as it gets wheedled back down, I completely agree. Like a customer is going to say, guys, you're still charging me 10 grand and I know that your costs have halved. I'm not doing that. And they'll go to someone that's like, I would have 8 or whatever the case might be. So how would that actually work then?
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance and different answers to this. I mean, on your first question around other stuff, like we're currently just a private holding company, is how we're setting ourselves up. Early on, we considered like, okay, well, could you raise a private equity fund over this? That's not necessarily my bag. Like, I don't necessarily want to worry about other people's money in the same way that, in Bitcoin, there's people that do want to hold other people's Bitcoin and there's people that don't. I just don't want to hold other people's Bitcoin. I don't want to hold other people's money in general. That just feels like something that I just, from a stress point of view, I just don't need. So I'm happy like with our own model at the moment. The way I looked at this, and it's pretty like, shout out to Paul from Stackwork here, was that when I first started talking to him about what he was doing at Stackwork, I realized it was one of the other people in the world that was having exactly the same thought process as us on a bigger scale, I would say, for those guys. But it was very much that, if you can take a business and you can optimize it, and that optimization would start to look originally like business process review. We say, okay, well, some companies have a bigger opportunity for improvements via business process review. So some of the heuristics that we would use, for instance, would be, do you have more than 4 people with the same job title? Now, if you do have more people than 4 people with the same job title, you've probably got a bit of definition in your process. So there's a process here, right? Because you've got 4 people doing the same thing. So if you've got 4 people doing the same thing, you've thought about it, you've written it down, you've had a look at it, you've had some discussions about what might be a good version and a bad version. There's a process that's probably driving those people's jobs. The next heuristic would be something like, does this person take words or text or sentences as like an input? And if they do, then there's a good point. There's probably some sort of like knowledge-based process. So if I'm a gardener, my input isn't necessarily words. My input is like grass,
mow the lawn.
I guess that is words in a way. But if I'm a bus driver, then my activity is I'm looking at the world and I'm reacting to it, sort of thing. If I'm a gardener, I'm looking at like the state of play, and then I'm making decisions based on that. If I'm like a knowledge worker sat at a computer, processing invoices or something, well, I'm more or less just taking data and words as an input to that. When you have those sort of things, you've probably got a good application of AI here, because the magic power of like LLMs that's kind of lost, I think, in a lot of the discussion of it, is that you can talk to the computer. It turns out it was the Grug brain answer all along, right? It's just, I can talk to the computer. All the other like definitions of AI and like what it is and the rest of it is like, holy shit, the computer can understand I've been rabbiting on for like 20 minutes in like the first answer here. I say a lot of things, and there's some value in there, but it's not all value. That's not how a computer would talk. So like the ability for a computer to understand you means that it can take what is a very human task and move it from human world, which is soft and undefined and all over the place, into computer world, which is structured and very process driven and can be completed very cheap and can run at like 1,000 times faster than you can think all of it. So really the big breakthrough, I think, with a lot of these LLMs is not the kind of like, oh, I can chat to it and it seems intelligent. It's it can understand human language, and I can just move from fluffy human world into structured computer world. And as soon as I'm in structured computer world, then I can do the same process as you 100 times quicker. Like we sort of saw this with like the SaaS revolution and automation revolution of the last sort of 20 years, is that like, yeah, if you can get something into a process that's fixed inside software, then you can run it much cheaper. Now the problem with things like SaaS was, okay, well this is a single process, which is like we need to sell it at a scale to everybody in the world to do this thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to have like a crap version of this process that does kind of like 80% of what you want, but doesn't really do the last bit. And then we'll sell that to everybody. It's still better that everybody adopts it. I think the difference now when computers can understand you is we can tease away all of these bits around the edge that were like the crap versions of the process. And we can make this very cheap, because the computer can now just start to understand all the crap that you said. Like, instead of you having to organize yourself in a particular way so the computer understands you, you can just talk to the computer and the computer can start to understand you and translate it into something that it can use. And so there's a lot of that I think is going to drive the automation aspects. Now, a good example of what this looks like in my own world right now is that I'm operating as a product lead inside Stackwork at the moment for their Bounties products. And we're developing this methodology called Hive, like I mentioned earlier. And the idea of Hive is like, okay, let's say you're a solo product manager or a product manager plus like a technical architect. How could you work without a software team and develop a whole software product? So what we do is, like, as soon as you take away 20 software engineers, then all of a sudden you've dropped your costs massively, like on any software product. Like that's the main part of things. Let's say that's your 80% cost saving right there. The question is, can you actually do it? So I do this like every day. This is how I'm developing this whole Bounty platform right now.
Wow.
Is that it turns out that AIs and LLMs are very good at creating software and coding things. If you ask them very, very, very specific questions about what it is they're trying to do. And so if you wanted to kind of create like a simple, like, I don't know, Chrome extension that if I click this, it does a thing, you can probably get it to do exactly that thing. if you want it to generate like a very complex software application with lots of moving parts and lots of things that are quite unique, it's going to really struggle to do that. Because when you say, make me a software application that does this, you just really haven't given it enough context to go on. And so I think it turns out that if you spend a lot of the time generating the context for, like, what is this product about? Why are we doing this? What are the features of this product? Okay, let's describe those features. Okay, what is this feature brief? What are the user stories? What are the requirements? What are the architecture components here that we have? What are the languages we're using? What have we already got in our code base? How can we update the code base? If I can do all of this stuff manually by just grabbing like snippets from my GitHub and my design docs and everything else and bringing them into the context window of an LLM, it can actually generate good code. It's not always perfect, though. So the way we actually execute this in real life is that we use the bounties. The bounties are like a human API. So it's like money. We use money as a human API. And we say, look, I will design this system, and I'll take a new feature that we want inside the bounties platform, break it down into all of the component parts, and I'll generate a series of effectively GitHub tickets, which are these bounties, which say, okay, we'll implement this in the database, implement this in the middleware, implement this in the front end. And there might be sort of 20 of these for a particular feature. And then instead of the machine actually doing the work to code this up, what we then do is we pay, say, 20 different people from across the world to implement each of those tickets. And then they create the pull requests for those tickets back into GitHub. And then as we merge them, hey presto, new feature. But we've done that without ever having like an on-staff software development team. Now, the costs of doing that, like only at the point of need, by creating very small like bounties and tasks to do any of that coding work, and then doing it with anybody in the world that's available to do it, because we've effectively scoped down this work to like 1 to 3 hour increments. We can do this at about, my estimate currently is about 20x less work and less money than I would pay to do this if I had
massive,
a
isn't it?
software engineering team. And we have new features daily inside this thing. We're not releasing on a quarterly basis. We're releasing every day. Every day we can move things forwards. The only bottleneck to this process right now is my time and my cognitive load, because there's always a trade-off, right? So the trade-off to working like this is it can be cheap, it can be fast, but you become a bottleneck. Like, so you as a product manager all of a sudden take all the cognitive load that would have been spread out across like a head of engineering and your senior engineers in the team and your junior engineers and what they're working off, and instead it all sits back in your head and you make all the decisions and you make all the trade-offs and the technical. So the point of the Hive methodology then is to take that and say, okay, well what sort of AI agents and support services would you want to make that work better? And so all of a sudden we can make this speed up. So the more work I do, the more easier my job gets and the faster I get that out. So that's an area that we're working on at the moment.
Amazing.
Really
cool,
building that engine. Yeah.
Thank you for explaining all of that. It's not something I had understood in this detail before. Forgive me if I'm butchering this, but so to try and make a real world example, I'm thinking of a software company that has 3 blokes called, junior developer. And you as the systems engineer can come in and say, okay, these 4 people are doing these tasks, and you can build like a very specific set of tasks that they'll have to go through to complete a job. Mm-hmm. And that's you as other stuff. But then you're working with Stackwork as a product guy separately to that, but you're able to use the Stackwork infrastructure to then go and get all of these different tasks coded up by individuals. And so I'm just trying to think through like how, so your business model is essentially find a business that that you as the systems expert can get a really good insight on. And now you're using this then process on the back end to help fulfill that. And you basically create an AI junior developer department for each company.
To an extent, yeah. So
okay.
the reality of it is right now the work that other staff is doing with Stackwork are doing so effectively like a consulting partnership. So
okay,
we're working with them to develop their products. Now, the question was maybe like 6 months ago, this is exactly what I wanted to build. I started talking to Paul. I realized he was already like a year ahead of where I was.
Yep,
I was
smart.
like, you know what? It's going to be easier for me to help you finish this off, and then we'll just work together on how we capitalize it. So currently we're building, like, that is an example of how we do it in software. There's other examples that's been done in various like process-driven businesses. So like legal discovery, for instance, is a very process-driven optimization. So we can do legal discovery very cheap using Stackwork workflows. So Stackwork workflow is effectively like an AI agent workflow that you would have.
Wow.
Take a big task and we break it down into the small steps. And say for each of those small steps, we then have a decision to make of, is this a computer step, like an LLM step, like an AI step, or is it a human step? And then effectively you can map out this whole process and you can say, okay, well, let's take the happy path and let's automate that entirely. Then let's take each of these edge cases, and sometimes like the AIs can solve some of these edge cases, and sometimes the human solves those edge cases. So in the Stackwork platform, they have, I think it's about 20,000 people around the world that work as stack workers that do like individual micro tasks for any of those parts of the workflow. So it could be that it's, you know, like let's say it was an image recognition problem that you had. AIs might get it 90% of the time, but they don't get to 100. Well, instead of just abandoning that workflow, we just push it out to 5 different people around the world and say, can you find the edge on this image? They'll tap it. And then now we're back into computer world and we can say, okay, well, from all the input we've got from humans, okay, well, let's now figure out which one is correct. Let's say 10 people tap an edge on an image, we can then say, well, 90% of them have tapped here, so this is where the edge is, and we've got pretty good confidence that that works. So we can take things that wouldn't normally be automatable inside computers and either solve it with an AI or solve it with a set of human input that we can buy on demand, because there's 20,000 people around the world with the app installed on their phone that will work for Bitcoin, that they get then paid instantly. So as soon as you complete that task, it might take you 5 seconds, you could earn $1 Bitcoin. In the computing world, same thing, right? It's the freedom to earn. If you have spare time, we can turn your spare time into Bitcoin, as long as you can solve programming bounties. Now, more and more, we're doing like design bounties through the bounties program as well. Like in the future, we might move to more marketing bounties. So we see this as like just a way of getting work done inside the real world.
Mm. Yeah, so it's interesting because, well, first of all, there's the AI kind of doom merchants that are like, it's going to destroy the world and you can't go near AI and the computers are coming, which I don't personally subscribe to at all. But it's helped as a view to ignore when I can chat to someone like yourself that goes, okay, well, I actually think a great way of making money is making businesses more efficient. We're going to do that using AI. And it sounds like this kind of headline grabby thing, but actually you've just explained in good detail how you do that, which is a specific type of business in a specific niche where you use words, as you mentioned. And so there are some like AI proof industries. Like you're not going to, well, someday there'll probably be a robot that mows the lawn, but like it's not actually going to happen anytime soon. There might well be an AI that runs the gardener's books far more efficiently than the current accounting process, for example. But it's cool when you break it down like that. It's like, it just, as long as you're super specific about what you're telling the computer, then you're able to get back what you need. How much then, Pete? Because this podcast I want to be about, financial returns, obviously very important, but it's also about like who we are and like where we benefited from going in a direction we didn't necessarily expect. When you first, like, how did you first become an engineer? How did you start looking at systems? And how much of that is now relevant to this job that you're kind of creating today? You'd be one of the few people in the world that are even thinking about this. And that to me is fascinating and a great investment, right? If you were to sell equity and other stuff, that would be really interesting to look at. Because it's like, okay, well, here's the Bitcoin hurdle rate. We're going to be buying Bitcoin, so you'll get that anyway. And we can get this efficiency here and get a whole lot of earlier profits than what you might expect out of this type of business. Maybe wind the clock back a bit and give us some more context. Like, how did you even get into this stuff?
So you might have noticed that I smirked a little bit when you said, like, how did you become an engineer? And it's because I don't really consider myself one at all. So
okay.
I did do engineering at uni, but I more or less went straight from getting like a master's engineering to trying to never be an engineer again the rest of my life, and just went straight into like project management out of Rolls-Royce in the UK. But I think the thinking has stuck with me. So I tend to consider myself non-technical, and then a lot of people say, no, you're quite technical. We've heard you talk. Like we know what you're saying.
Yeah.
And it was always.
I mean, I would think of you as like probably a more technical person. If I was to go and ask something, I'd be like, oh, Pete might know.
Yeah, and I'm embracing it, right? Like it's, as I said, it's not. I just think I'm less technical than other technical people. And maybe that's the answer there. But like specifically around coding, like my journey into AI was to say, I've had for 20 years, I've been annoyed that I couldn't code my own stuff. It just bothered me. And I think the issue was that I was just never great at syntax in programming language. I could understand how a system worked at a high level, and I've done a lot of sort of architecture work on how systems should act, or like how it interfaces with like a part of an organization or the business process review. But I could never write code because I would just forget stuff. Like I wouldn't put my semicolons in. I'd forget like what the functions were called, and like it turns out that AI is brilliant at that. So at the start of 2024, I sat down and taught myself to code. And what used to be something that I would every couple of years I'd try for a couple of months and just hit a wall and just go, it's not worth it.
Fuck this.
In 2 weeks, I was more or less done. I was just coding up new apps on the daily, and I was like, oh shit, this is amazing. And like that gave me a really good sort of insight into, this thing is like a learning superpower here. It's filled in the gaps. It would take the way I would sometimes talk about it with code was traditionally when you code stuff, people that code spend a lot of time Googling code that they should write. And they would go, right, how do I do this? And you get a Stack Overflow answer, and it sort of tells you what you should do, but it doesn't quite tell you what you should do. The interesting thing about AI is that you get the same sort of paradigm, but instead of telling you sort of what you should do, it tells you exactly what you could do. And all of a sudden that repetition loop goes from, right, I've looked something up, I've tried it, it's not quite work. I look up something else, I try it, it doesn't quite work. And maybe after like a full day, I've figured out what I was supposed to learn from all of these answers. With the AI, I can just say, how does this work? And it tells me exactly. And I say, okay, well, can you explain that to me? And it explains it to me. And that your repetition loop for learning goes from like a day or a couple of days down to 10 minutes. Every time you sit down, you can learn something and actually come away with it.
That's incredible, isn't it?
That's sort of what moved me more into the AI space. Is like once I'd had that personal recognition, it's like I can see how this is going to work. And then you said about like how the past sort of influences you as well. Back in a previous job, I used to run a bunch of the research projects for Oracle. So we would do a lot of like high performance compute work where we would have like large GPU clusters, and we would make them available for different research teams to use for doing things like, AI-based drug discovery. So like what random compounds that exist in this list of like 20 million known compounds that are kind of safe for human consumption. Can any of them solve this disease? Like what's solid for cancer? Like what's good for Alzheimer's? Like what can we repurpose that we already use? And you come up with some interesting results on things like that. But it's a hard problem. And one of the things that I learned in doing that work, by helping manage that process and talking to the engineers on the daily, was how are you building these programs? How does it work? And I sort of gained this appreciation for very much like pipeline-driven development as opposed to app development, where it was very much like they would have a lot of composable units that all work individually. And then you take in an input and you produce an output, and then that gets blown away because it's almost like you only build the computer for the sake of doing this 5-minute job, and then that computer no longer exists, and then you build a new computer and you do something completely different with the output from that last part of the process. And that really resonated with my earlier process design work. So I was like, oh, this is what I would have done in like a SciPoc diagram sort of thing, figuring out like, okay, well, how are we passing things around an organization like this? And it really like hit me that like, oh, this is probably how AIs will work, is that we can have all of these individual little processes and workflows, and then I can just hang those together. And I could do this inside an organization, and then all of a sudden, like, oh, look, I've built an organization that's AI native because I can just take the human task that I was already going to define inside a process flow and a workflow anyway. And I can just use AIs to accomplish a bunch of these things. And assuming that you can do it all hands off, then it's more or less free compared to doing it with a human. And so that was a big realization as well. It was like, oh, right, that's an opportunity there. If I can do the same job as somebody else, but I don't have to pay for the person to do the job, all right, well, I should be able to make something out of that. And then I think the big unlock talking to Paul from Sphinx was like, yeah, that's good 80% of the time. And then the 20% is going to fuck you up. So how do you deal with the 20%? We use bounties. We just pay a human to do the work. So you flip the process from saying, instead of starting an organization and you would say, like, okay, who are the people I need in this organization to deliver this work? You would take a view and you'd say, okay, well, what is the process that I need to do this? And then from the process, I would look at the steps. From the steps, I would define, is it a computer step? Is it an AI step? Is it a person step? And then instead of starting with the human at the center of the organization, we sort of move them more to the edge. And we say, okay, well, what if the whole thing just ran automated? And then we could just bring in the human like at the point of need.
It's fascinating. And so, Pete, it's not ironic at all, but it's like you're a master engineer that actually is using your product and more commercial leaning to orchestrate this modern form of compute power that's just that much more easy to listen to learn from, to use. And in the stickier scenarios where it just doesn't quite work, you're like, okay, boom, now we get a person in to do that. And so you absolutely are an engineer. If anything, you're an extraordinarily efficient engineer compared to the engineer you were previously trying not to be, which leads me nicely to this idea of deflation. Anyone that's halfway down the Bitcoin rabbit hole would have started thinking about this. Like, well, hang on, if we're getting better because we're making stuff faster and we're making stuff cheaper and we're making stuff stronger, which makes things cheap, like, why is the price going up? So to go back to what we kind of touched on before, just run us through how you think of the mechanics then between that kind of deflation that you've just described so well, which is basically this idea that, or at least an idea that I like talking through, is like, how long is it going to be until there's $1 billion company that's just one person? I.e., they create $1 billion of value, but it's just one of them, and they're just that efficient. And then to interlay that with, well, actually, we've just got governments all around us that just want to print more money. So how's that going to really work when you see this happening at scale?
Yeah, I mean, I know the sort of stats that we discuss, talking to Paul from StatWork, would be that it's what you find is that you don't necessarily remove all the people from the process. It is more like an 80-20 sort of thing. Like, whereas right now we could probably remove 80% of the people from the process. Like, I mean, which is huge. that's no small thing, right? If you can do something at 20% of the cost of what you were doing previously, then that's a huge win. But you never quite get rid of everything because of all the edge cases. There's a point you made earlier about like the AI doomerism, and so, is it going to destroy everything and take all the jobs? And to a certain extent, I think it is. Like, I'm not against the AI doomerism thing completely. Like, I think this is going to be massively deflationary. In the sense,
so to be clear, my doomerism is more like, it's more like I'm going to be controlled by an AI. Whereas I agree with you that a lot of jobs are going to be completely disrupted. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, okay. Well, we might be able to touch on that as well, because there's some interesting stuff I was posting about the other day. So in terms of deflation, my expectation is, it seems right now I could look at this as a piece of software and like what we could do with it and what I could do with it if I had like unlimited time. And I think I could automate a lot of jobs using the current level of software just by better integrating it into workflow management systems and solving some of the problems that we have right now about AI memory. Now, workflow management systems we have at StatWork, we've had those forever. Like, there's lots of different versions of those. That's not like a massive technical note. People have figured that out. The next one is probably like AI memory could be better, which means how can I tell the AI exactly what it needs to know when I ask it a question? So like, if I ask it a question, it gives me an answer and it's not correct, I get annoyed. The answer to that is you use computer systems we already have. Specifically, graph databases are very good at this, and we look up the answer before we ask the question. So we effectively ask the AI the question and give it the answer and just say, just tell me that at the same time. And we've done that as well in Stackwork. That's been an ongoing project with those guys for like 3 years now, looking at second brain and like how do we take knowledge and understand it in a way that we can make it useful for AIs and these different workflows. And so if you've got like good models, good workflows, good memory, and like, you know, the ability to just bring in the correct context at the right time, I would look at that and say, okay, there's maybe like anybody that sits in front of a computer, anybody that's got the same job title as somebody else, we could probably take a massive chunk of the work out of that job. And then what we've seen in practice is that, yeah, it's probably about 80% of the work that's out there. So huge level of deflation there. You're going to do a lot more stuff a lot quicker at a lower cost base. And that doesn't, like, there we're talking about cost reduction. The other thing that we never really touched on was you've not only reduced the fixed costs for what you've had, but you've just eliminated humans as your scaling factor, right? Previously, you would have had to scale up the size of the human team to keep going with the size of the output and the revenue we're generating. You no longer have to do that if you've automated the process up front. That's always been the play with automation and software, is you get it right, you automate it, and then you can grow massively without the human being like an anchor on that process.
Yeah.
So long story short is that I can look at what I can do now and go, oh, I could automate a whole bunch of jobs using this. And then it's really just like my imagination, capital, and time that would stop me. But there's more imagination out there, there's more time out there, there's more capital than I've got. So I would look at it and go, right, people are looking at this, and people are definitely looking at this. This isn't something that just I know. There's a lot of money like circling around these different ideas and looking at investing in these specific problems. And then I would look about, say, 5 years down the line, and I go, I can see a world where this has played out. And what's happened is we've now just reset at a much lower cost, like price base, effectively, is that everything is cheaper. And it should be brilliant, right? That should be a beautiful future. Like, who doesn't want everything that they need to get cheaper to produce? That would be great. Because if nothing else, if we start, even if we can't automate all the physical world stuff, right? If we automate all the knowledge worker stuff, then we've got more people to do the physical world stuff. So again, competition will still bring down all of these prices. So I think there's a huge like deflationary moment here with the adoption of AI. And I could see a world where everything is really cheap. What's not obvious to me is the path that we take from A to B. And I feel like this could be very disruptive when you start to think about the second order consequences of, well, if a lot of people have to move from one job to a new job, that's not usually like an overnight thing. If I happen to do a lot of knowledge work, now I'm a farmer, okay, that might work out if I look at here and I look at here, but in between, there was probably a lot of pain, you know, and then inside that pain, okay, well, did I have a mortgage? Like, what is a mortgage? A mortgage is like a 30-year levered bet on the idea that your salary never goes down. Well, we were also just talking a moment ago that what's going to happen is the cost of everything goes down. So if the cost of everything goes down, the revenue of the company goes down, like the nominal wages are going to go down. So I could see a world where a lot of people's mortgages are put at risk all of a sudden, because now you just can't even pay the principal on the loan, never mind like the fact that you eventually pay off the amount. Yes, a house is a good thing to own over like a 30-year period of time because it's more scarce than money, but it requires you to have a job that pays you a specific amount. And I don't know what it's like where you live, but I would look around school where I am and I would go, I know your job and I know your house. You've got a very large mortgage on this thing. And I imagine if the two of you don't work full time all the time, that will be hard to keep up. And like that's worrying, because when people start losing houses and start losing money, then that's where you get the government stepping in. I think that leads to more inflation. So then maybe it's the nominal prices go back up and salaries actually go up, but it will be momentarily. But we're still going to have this massive deflationary push down to those things. So I don't know if I have any good answers to those things. So I feel like the future is bright after the fact. When we move into the deflationary world, I think what we want is prices to go down. I think the risk to be aware of in that transition is don't bank on your specific job now not being automated. And I think particularly the people that would have taken out a lot of these like larger mortgages might be more knowledge work friendly people. I mean, I'm probably one
Brokers,
of the few people in the world that is just
lawyers.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of people that I think will be impacted by this sort of thing, more because the whole industry just moves into a cheaper model. And I think we see that if there's money to be made from making something cheaper, and there's no real barrier to entry to making it cheaper, it is going to get made cheaper. So
it's very interesting, isn't it? And I agree with you, that whole idea of like, obviously you don't know someone's personal finances, but something doesn't add up if it gets derailed. Well, Pete, I mean, I've got 10 other questions here, but our hour has come to a very, very swift end. So
I've talked too much.
No, you haven't. This is what, for me, this is all about. I love learning from people. And if you don't catch up semi-regularly, everyone makes so much progress. You just don't even know what they're working on in some senses. But Pete, thank you so much for your time today. Oh, please. If you have time, please do. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I can talk really long. But
okay.
I was going to hit you with one more example on, you mentioned about AI controlling you.
Yes.
I think that's probably more of a big boogeyman. Like, is there going to be one big AI that controls everything? I don't think that's the case, but I think an interesting data point, a saying that I've been using a lot recently is like, you're going to work for AI or AI is going to work for you. I honestly think one of the main differentiators here is going to be like when you adopt it and if you buy Bitcoin, because I do think AIs will generally use Bitcoin in what they do. And I was tweeting about this the other day. The source was, well, I have AIs that pay people Bitcoin to do stuff. And the specific example that we had was, again, in StackWork, one of the goals that we have for the current program I'm working on is, okay, I want to give this 100% test code coverage. And so what we do is we have an AI agent that will go and query our graph of all of our code. And it looks at it and says, okay, well, are there any functions in here that don't have a unit test associated with it? It finds those tests, it pulls them out, and it goes to another AI agent effectively and says, okay, write me a unit test for this. And then now it's got a test. And it says, right, to make this into a change to the code, I need PRs for GitHub and various things. Now, we haven't integrated with GitHub. What we've done instead is that we generate bounties. And so we write a bounty and says, here's a function inside this code base that's open source. Here's the unit test that we want to implement inside this. And we've written the unit test for you. And we say, and here's $15, so 15,000 sats. If you create a PR on this code base, we'll pay that. And so what happens is somebody comes along, takes the bounty, does the work, and then submits that to GitHub. Now, one interesting thing there is we didn't, potentially you could just do all of that automated. In general, there'll be an edge case there that you want to check. So you have the human implement it and they check it and then submit it. But for them, this is like a 5-minute task. And so all of a sudden, what you've got there is a human in the real world that made a real change to a real code base that was open source on GitHub, which is an interface that we would use via keyboard, chairs, humans, Flash, all the rest of it. But the whole process was kicked off by an AI that I gave a goal of, I would like 100% test code coverage on this software. Now, I didn't create that work. I didn't sign that work necessarily. I might click a button to say, yep, this person can do it. I might click the button at the end to merge it. But all of that workflow, that person worked for the AI for Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's mad. Wow.
And this has been possible. I mean, we've had people working inside all of these workflows for Bitcoin for years. Here's a specific task where the task itself came from the AI doing Bitcoin.
And so in that sense, Pete, you are actually working for the AI.
Yeah.
So actually that's my comment about the AI doom scrollers is actually kind of on point, isn't it? I've got to kind of rejig that slightly.
Yeah, so if you think about it, the AI worked for me in the sense that I set it a goal and gave it a budget. So I said, here's your budget, here's the goal. It goes and finds the changes that it needs. It does 80% of the work. This might have been an hour task if I just sent somebody the name of a function and told them to write the test. But instead, it sends them a bounty and the instructions, the example code, how to do it, where to make the change. So all of a sudden, we reduced 80% of the work. The AI decided that it was going to make a bounty out of it. It puts the cost on it and sends it out into the public forum, and then people just pick that up. That is nuts. This is people working for machines. And nobody really knows that that's happening at the moment.
No.
But it's mad.
And,
It's like,
and
it could be
actually,
anything.
when you take that bounty, you don't know where it's come from.
Yeah.
And so what might be a bounty in the future? We don't know. But you've given us a very concrete example.
Well, and you could also
Pete,
imagine that
wow.
somebody would pick that up and use AI to solve the bounty themselves, right? So they might not even know how to code yet, but they go, I'll go and do this. And they go and use an AI to help explain to them how to do the process that we want, to check the unit test, to give them advice on how to achieve it. And I don't care necessarily. All I want is the test to happen. And if I can get it done for the right cost, then I don't mind. As long as it meets the acceptance criteria that I've got, then it goes in. And as soon as you do that, the bottleneck is only, like, let's say, my ability to assign these things. So then we add like a self-assigning thing. So you can come along. If there's a $10 job, you can say, okay, well, I'll deposit $10 of Bitcoin now to get that job. And then when I finish it, I get $25 back, whatever the full amount would be. And then all of a sudden, there's almost like there's no constraint to how quickly you can get this work done, because I could have 10,000 people working simultaneously for me, or I could have none. But you can burst up to getting the work done when you need it, and then you come back down and you only pay for the work to be done. And you don't really care who does it. You don't care where they live, because it's Bitcoin. I can pay anybody anywhere around the world. So it gives us this ability to do this work at this like micro scale. So here's an hour's work. Will you do it for $10? If not, will you do it for 20? Will you do it for 50? Will you do it for 1,000? Like there's some level at which you can start to draw people in. But it's crazy.
But you can immediately see how much more efficient that is. And not to like, I want to go back to that kind of concept of like an AI telling you what to do. In this specific case, we're talking about very small tasks that a specific type of educated human can do. So they're coming along and they're doing a very, very small thing for your software project, essentially. What happens if the AI tells it to achieve that in a way that is actually not what you want? If that makes sense. Like the more dystopian side of this is like, okay, well, hang on. If you've got an AI interpreting how to complete a task, what if it suddenly suggests complete the task using a more dangerous and more nefarious approach? Would that be impossible because you've trained the AI initially?
It's not necessarily impossible, but you could have safeguards.
Yes.
So
okay.
it would be odd because if you think about all that the AI knows, is it only comes into being for the seconds it requires to then write a unit test for something, and then it almost gets destroyed. So it only knows what you told it to know in that moment.
Yes. Okay.
Like saying,
interesting.
Your
so
job is to write unit
knowledge
tests,
capacity is not only time finite. The actual knowledge itself is very specific, and there's nothing additional that's given. Okay, interesting.
But you could imagine. But then what you actually have is because even in that example, it's not like there's an AI that does that. There's multiple different like AI agents and steps and calls that actually complete it. So let's say there's 50 different AIs in there, and they only ever know the one step that they're working on at one time and what we've told it that it needs to know to complete that task. But that could be any sort of task. You could imagine a situation where, let's say you had an AI and the AI had a goal. And the overarching goal was that you needed to go and find a new premises for your pizza place. To go back to the example from earlier, right? You say, okay, well, the AI can't. Maybe it can look at retail listings and it could like evaluate the scripts and the descriptions that are in there and the sizes and the various data that's available. But it can't go and look at it. But it could interpret a photo. So there's no reason why a bounty couldn't just be, all right, human, go to this place. Here's the address. Here's the place. I want people that are available in Melbourne. I want you to go into this building. I want you to take photos. I want these photos to be taken. I want you to upload them into the system and then hit the button to say you're done. And then I'll look at them and I'll evaluate the thing. So I'll pay you if you have a photo of like this angle in this corner and this angle in this corner. And I figured that out from the floor plan that I had. And then I could just generate like a model of the back of that, or maybe they could stitch it into a 3D model. Maybe it just looks at the pictures and can interpret stuff. But you could see that there's a role here for something that it would be very hard for an AI to like give you advice on which building you might want to take. But if it could go and visually look and inspect all of those buildings because it can pay a human to do that, then you think, you know what, it probably could give me some good advice on these things. And all of a sudden, now you've got an AI that can use money as an interface back to the real world to get stuff done. Or if there was physical paperwork that needed to be filed, I could have an AI that then paid a bounty to somebody to go and submit the physical paperwork.
Yeah.
Like this is how we cross some of these otherwise quite like blurred lines. You go, oh, well, it can't do anything in the real world. Well, but it can pay people to do stuff in the real world. And that's how we do everything. Like companies are constructs that pay people money to do stuff in the real world, right? So
yes, and
so
as
we
a
know it
systems
works.
engineer, they're essentially just a curation of aggregated tasks that are all facilitated by money in some way. That is a company, right? Wow, cool. Pete, so okay, let me have one last question then, if you have a little time. Thank you.
No,
which is really around this idea of native digital payments using Bitcoin, and it's something that's not altogether obvious, but I think very interesting in that, as you've described, you're paying these bounties. Would this work without a native digital currency like Bitcoin? And how much more inefficient would it be if you didn't have the Bitcoin rails to build it on?
I don't think it does work, or at least it isn't as effective, right? There is a difference, and it's not obvious unless you use both of the systems, between if I want to try and get a developer in, I don't know, Ukraine via Upwork, and the level of like paperwork and trust involved in that agreement and that contract on both of our sides, versus if I wanted to do the same piece of work via a bounty. The idea of the bounties is to really like lower the cost of the exchange down to a level where we're both willing to just go with it. You know, if I'm going to hire you for an hour, like I don't need to write a big contract about like my expectations of your performance, and what we're going to do. And it's like, look, for the sake of a few hours, I'm just going to stream you the money effectively. And this is like the big unlock of Lightning, right? If you imagine, I'm just going to stream you money, and maybe I stream you like $50 a day, maybe I stream you like $500 a day. Like it depends on what the scale of the work we're doing and like what your risk appetite for that sort of thing is. But there's a point at which it's easier for me to just hire you to do part of the job and see if you do it than it is for me to write a contract about how we should work together.
Yes.
And so if you're aware of like, the guy's name, is it Ronald Kaus? I think he has the theory of the firm. And the idea is that the firm is built up from these units where there's a transaction cost that stops you from outsourcing the work. So effectively, you would have somebody inside your own business because it's cheaper to onboard them into your business and keep them internal than it is to have them outside, because the transaction cost of all of the contracting, the payments, the fees, managing quality and all of that is harder outside the firm than inside the firm. And that's why firms are a particular size. It's driven by transaction costs. One of the things with Bitcoin is it lowers that transaction cost, because we don't need to have reversible payments. I don't need to worry about, I've sent you like $1,000 over the course of a week, and then you go and reverse all that, and now I'm out of pocket. Like all of that can go away, and I can pay you for an hour's work. And then if that's done well, I can pay you for another hour's work, and another hour, and another hour, and another hour. And all of a sudden we've got this like nice peer-to-peer sort of relationship where money flows one way and work flows the other, and vice versa. And we build up that trust from like a very low base. But it means that I can just start trusting people that have no experience, that are anonymous on the internet, that really I just want the outcome to be the work is complete and the work just flows in. And if the work flows in, the money flows back the other way, right? And it's kind of beautiful, low friction way of getting that work done. And I don't think that exists without Bitcoin because of credit. As soon as you bring credit into the mix, which is so every like day-to-day payment we make is effectively credit. Nobody final settles for stuff. I mean, perhaps with cash you can do this, but you can't do it at a distance, and you can't do it over the internet. So I think you do need that like, sort of digital cash in order to settle these payments.
And I immediately start thinking about Nostr as well, and how having a digital identity connected to a Bitcoin wallet, and how easy it is to like basically just search someone on Nostr, find them, boom, you can zap them, and off you go. I would imagine like bounty hunters who've done like thousands of these jobs with Nostr profiles that show that it just immediately seamlessly connects, and how cool that would be.
Yeah. I mean, I have started manually posting a lot of the bounties into Nostr as well now. So
Okay.
I'm like, because my long-term view of Nostr, as we talked about at Cheat Code, is that I sort of feel like Nostr is the market. It's like the machine-readable market of the future. So all of the services, all of the discovery makes sense there, because you're going to want stuff signed by a private key so you know where it came from. It needs some sort of neutral place to be found and discovered, and Nostr does those two things.
Yes.
Huge. Eventually, I think this will just become the place where people advertise jobs, services, reputation, like
everything.
We put it all onto Nostr.
Wow.
It's not there now, and I'll try and bootstrap what I can with this, with sharing the bounties. But I think there's a very natural fit between those two things. Of like, well, where's the work? Okay, we're generating work. Where do we put it? Well, it should probably exist on Nostr.
A brief insight on, so launched the podcast, and week 1, I think I got about 1,000 unique views across all the content I posted, of which 900 was via Nostr. So I was using nostr.build to post videos, and I got 500 views on a video. And meantime, YouTube, you're getting like 3, 5. Now, admittedly, like that will change as you consistently post on the larger legacy platforms. But one of my fears with Nostr was like, there's no reach. And then in a week of doing it, it's like, that's just not true. So there's probably a lot more going on than you realize. You just don't have the same transparency that you would have with some of the platforms that are essentially selling eyeballs. They have to be transparent.
Yeah, well, or is it? I don't know. I sometimes wonder how true these things were. Like in previous businesses, I've done like Facebook adverts, but my Facebook advert stats and who was clicking through didn't seem to match like what I was recording.
What sales were being done? Really? Yeah, well, mate, who knows? Maybe they've been cooking their books forever. Oh, we'll have to leave that for another time. Pete, legend, thank you so much for teaching me about all of that. It's a very, very valuable insight into something that's really going to change how we do business and how businesses are structured. And very best of luck building other stuff. And thank you so much for your time.
All right. Cheers, mate.